steps. Step number one, we have to understand inflation is extremely nuanced. Let's go right to the charts. And I've combined three charts together to give you an idea of how this works. It's a little confusing at first glance, but I think you'll understand once we walk through it. It goes back to 2000 all the way to 2020. The left-hand side indicates the dollar index, the DXY, going from 80 all the way up to 115. On the right-hand side, that is the S&P 500, from 500 all the way up to 3,000. So let's start with the United States dollar. That's what everyone thinks about when they hear the word inflation. So this is the dollar on the DXY compared to a basket of other currencies, mainly the euro. In 2000, at 110, goes up a bit, then comes all the way down and kind of trends down until we get to 2008. In 2008, it jumps up during the GFC, but then goes right back down to a low at 80. And I think this is a monthly number. So during the month, it could have got a lot lower than that. I think it went down to 75, if not a little lower. Since 2010, the dollar has gone straight up to where it is today, over 100 once again. So if the United States dollar is getting weaker and stronger over this time, you would think that inflation as measured by the CPI, so the prices of the stuff you buy on a daily basis, would also go up or down. But you would be wrong. Let's look at the CPI itself compared to the United States dollar. The CPI is represented by the blue line, which basically goes straight up from left to right without skipping a beat, except for a very short time in 2008 where it notched down just slightly. But look at 2008 all the way to 2020. It pretty much just goes straight up uninterrupted, while at the same time the dollar from 2010 to 2020 has gone up as well. How is it possible for the dollar to go up and inflation and consumer prices to go up at the same time? But let's take it one step further and look at the S&P 500 compared to both. Starting in 2000, the S&P goes down. We know the crash of the dot-com bubble. In 2002, it hits a low, then goes up till we get to 2007, 2008. The GFC comes crashing all the way down till we bottom out around 2009. Since that time, it's done nothing but go straight up. So if the dollar was correlated from a standpoint of inflation to the CPI or to the S&P 500, if the dollar is going up, the S&P 500 should be going down. If the dollar is going up, the CPI should be going down. And we can see based on this chart that it doesn't always work that way. In fact, throughout the last 20 years, many times they've done the complete opposite. And I'd also like to throw in housing. I didn't chart this because I didn't want the chart itself to get too confusing. Let's remember in 2006, we hit the peak for housing prices in the United States, and we hit a low in 2012. What happened to the dollar during that time? Did it go racing higher? No, of course not. It actually went down during that time, and you can see that consumer prices went up during that time. So my point with this chart is when we talk about inflation and whether or not Peter Schiff is right or wrong, we have to first separate asset inflation from foreign exchange inflation or CPI inflation. And then once we get to the CPI inflation, are we talking about food, automobiles, energy, shelter? Are we talking about the price of homes? Or are we talking about how much it costs to rent a home? Are we talking about education? Or are we talking about health care? To dive into these nuances a little further and to hear from Peter Schiff himself, let's go straight to one of his recent podcasts.
But as far as how prices can change in an inflationary environment, oh yeah. I mean, look, I went over this on the last podcast. Prices of some things can go down, even as when you're having inflation, because prices of other things go up. Think about this. Let's say today, and I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say that the average household spends 5% of their income on food. Let's say it's a very small expense. And let's say the price of food goes up so much that now people have to spend 50% of their income on food. Well, if you're spending 50% of your income on food, there's a lot of things that you used to buy that you're not buying anymore. And so if a lot of people are now in the same boat, spending half their money on food, and now they're not buying a lot of other things, then the price of those things could go down. But it doesn't matter to the people who are spending half their money on food if the price of the things that they can no longer afford anyway have now gone down. And so you're going to have that. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think real estate is going to do so poorly, is because I think people are going to have to cut back on what they can pay in rent. I think people are going to end up renting out rooms and taking, or families will be sharing houses, things like that. And because they need money, they need to free up money for food. And other things are going to get more expensive during inflation. So yes, you can certainly see things that come down in price in an inflationary environment. Now, of course, if there's hyperinflation, right, everything is going to go up in price, except that some things are going to go up in price much faster. So in hyperinflation, the price of food will go up much more, let's say, than the price of a house, right? The price of a house might go up 10%, and the price of food might go up 1,000%.
Step number 2, to understand whether or not Peter Schiff is right or wrong about inflation, we also have to understand deflation. There's nuance to this as well. When most people say the word inflation, they're referring to prices going up. When most people talk about deflation today, they talk about asset prices in debt. So to be very, very clear, as I'm talking about inflation or deflation for the rest of this video, I'm going to be referring to consumer prices like food, energy, shelter, education, healthcare, transportation, entertainment, and taxes. We can't forget about that. So to understand deflation a lot better and why some people and a lot of economists today see deflation as the boogeyman, let's look at two completely separate economies. On our left, we have an economy very similar to the 1800s, so very little debt and low regulation. In this economy, we have 3 farmers. One guy is growing cows that look like rabbits. Another guy is growing corn, and another guy is producing cotton. And because they're producing a lot, it frees up other people in the economy to do things like becoming a doctor, a plumber, or a carpenter. In this type of economy, consuming equals producing. Meaning, as you produce more, you consume more. There's a direct correlation. And you may be saying, well, duh, George, I get that. But yeah, it's not that simple. Wait till we get to the next economy that's more representative of 2020. So let's say in this economy, we have another cow farmer or dairy farmer, or whatever you call them, the guys that grow cows, and another guy that grows corn, and another farmer that produces cotton. And they come into this economy because they see it as an up and coming market. They think they can make money there as well. They compete with the other farmers to produce better goods and services at lower prices. As a result of these lower prices, it actually increases the demand in the real economy. Why? Because the doctors, plumbers, and carpenters can buy more cows, they can buy more corn, and they can buy more cotton. Or they can take the money that they saved by buying cheaper cows, corn, and cotton, and they can spend it on other things in the economy. This creates a better standard of living, and for the farmers, it creates more sales, just like we see today in electronics. So in this type of economy with low debt and low regulations, the more stuff that is produced, the lower the prices. This increases the demand. This is what the real economy and free market capitalism is all about. And let's remember, from the year 1800 to 1900, prices went down by 50%, while GDP, nominal GDP, and nominal wages went up. Now let's go over to the high debt, high regulatory economy that we have today. Same farmers producing cows, corn, and cotton, and we have the doctors, plumbers, and carpenters. But this time, the consuming is a lot different than it was in the older economy. Before, we had the amount of consumption in the economy, a direct result of the amount of production. But to be clear, now in 2020, in a high debt, high regulatory economy, the amount of consuming is more a result on debt or access to debt, cheap debt, and asset prices being inflated. And it has a lot less to do with the amount of productivity or the producing of goods and services. So in this type of economy, when you have lower prices, it decreases the amount of demand, which lowers the amount of sales. In other words, what drives this economy is debt and asset prices because it's been financialized. Therefore, if you have lower debt, lower asset prices, it decreases the amount of demand. Where in the older economy, debt and asset prices have nothing to do with demand whatsoever. The key component of demand in the older economy is how much stuff the economy can actually produce. So the argument the deflationists have today is there's so much debt in the system and asset prices are so high that they want to deflate. They want to come down in price. If that happens, there's going to be less demand in the real economy, and that's going to bring down consumer prices as well. When we go into step number 3, I'll tell you what they might be missing. Step number 3. This is what nobody is talking about, but it's the key to understanding whether or not Peter Schiff is right about inflation. So everyone looks at the demand side of the equation, but they forget the supply side, and that is crucial. To illustrate my point, let's look at another example economy. In this economy, there are only 2 goods and services. We have 3 McDonald's restaurants and 1 airline. And the airline just goes back and forth between Miami and Los Angeles. So we'll start with franchisee Frank. He owns all 3 of these McDonald's franchises. So what happens to Frank if we have less demand in the economy? To understand these crucial details, let's go right to a P&L of an actual McDonald's franchise. The average McDonald's restaurant generates $2.7 million of revenue per year. Cost of goods sold, $918,000, which represents 34% of the gross revenue. So gross profits would be 66% of that, or $1.782 million. But I want to point out that crew payroll is $540,000, manager about $100,000, and then payroll taxes $54,000. You add that up, and we've got roughly $700,000 going to employee payroll. which is 26% of their gross revenue. This is really important because McDonald's pays low wages, usually around minimum wage. So there's not a lot of room for them to drop their wages if their revenue goes down. There are some line item costs that have flexibility, but once we get down to the non-controllable expenses, they're pretty much fixed. We've got rent, insurance, taxes, which most likely will go up, and we have depreciation, interest, etc. So the bottom line is the McDonald's franchisee walks away with about $150,000 at the end of the year, which is a 5.7% profit margin. With profit margins this thin and a payroll which is relatively fixed, if demand goes down, let's say their top line decreases by 20 or 30%, they have nowhere to go. They can't reduce their payroll. They can't reduce their costs. So the only option they have is to go out of business. So if franchisee Frank has 3 McDonald's locations and he has to go down to 1 McDonald's location, keep in mind, he can't really drop the prices in the one location because most of his costs are fixed, especially wages, which represent 26% of his entire gross revenue. So if franchisee Frank was accustomed to making $100,000 a year, let's say he was making that with all 3 franchises, if he now only has 1 restaurant, he's still going to try to make the $100,000 a year. He's definitely not going to lower prices to do that. What's he going to do? He's going to increase prices. And you may be saying to yourself, well, George, demand decreased substantially, so how is he going to raise his prices? Because there's less supply. At a certain point, supply is destroyed to the point where the demand-supply equilibrium matches up. So you might also be asking yourself, yeah, George, but what about the suppliers? Won't they lower their prices because they have less demand, so Frank will have lower input costs on the food side of the equation? Not really, because the same thing that happened to Frank will also happen to his suppliers in the sense that their major cost, or a good majority of their costs, are fixed in the form of payroll. They can't go lower than the minimum wage. So those entities that can't afford to produce the product will just go out of business. So the only suppliers left for Frank's 1 McDonald's location most likely won't lower their prices at all. If anything, they'll increase their prices just like Frank did. Now let's move on to the airline. Let's say they had 10 flights going back and forth between Los Angeles and Miami per day. So the 3 people that live in Miami and the 3 people that live in LA have plenty of options. And because the airline went back and forth so many times, they could charge a pretty low rate, let's call it $200, and still make a good amount of profit at the end of the year. But if demand goes way, way down because of the cerveza sickness, as an example, they'll most likely reduce the number of flights they have over time to, let's say, 1 flight. But then what do? Do they leave the price at $200? Absolutely not. They'll jack the prices to, let's say, $400, and these aren't actual numbers, we're just using them as an example, because the airline needs to make $1 billion a year, let's say. Because they've got shareholders. They don't want to reduce their annual revenue. They don't want to reduce their annual profit. So they'll do anything they can to maintain the level of profit, if not increase. So the 10 flights go down to 1 flight, and the price of the 1 flight goes up. And we can see evidence of this playing out right now. My good buddy Jason Hartman with jasonhartman.com, the premier real estate expert, but also a very keen macro thinker, sent me over some data just the other day about flights he was looking at from Miami to LA. And what do you think happened? Editor, throw up the chart. Sure enough, the prices were pretty stable, but then the cerveza sickness hit and prices plummeted from, let's say, $250 all the way down to under $100. So super cheap flights for a short period of time, but then what happens? They reduce the amount of flights available. In other words, they reduce the supply. And what happens to prices? They go up even higher than they were prior to the cerveza sickness when there was a lot more demand. And let's not forget, when things open back up, there will most likely be a lot more costs associated with doing business, not just in the restaurants, the airlines. You can go down the list. They're going to have a lot more regulations and a lot more compliance. Why? Because they need to reduce their liability. What happens if someone goes to a restaurant, a McDonald's, it's open back up, they get the cerveza sickness, and then heaven forbid they pass away? You think there's not going to be a lawsuit involved there? So their insurance costs are going to go through the roof. It's one of the reasons healthcare is so expensive in the United States. And you'll most likely see the exact same thing playing out in restaurants, airlines, etc. With the additional costs, how are they not going to increase their prices without going out of business? And at the end of the day, the cure for low prices are, you got it, low prices. Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's not forget about Insolvent Sam. He is up here. Looks like he is completely wasted. Got the jug of moonshine right there. So he is definitely your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam. That is for sure. And he's also holding a sign or a kite. I'm not sure what it is, but it says, "I love heli money." So I'm assuming insolvent Uncle Sam is talking about helicopter money. He loves helicopter money, and there's no disputing that, because the more helicopter money insolvent Uncle Sam can rain down on the entire economy, the more votes he buys. So as the supply of goods and services in the real economy is shrinking over a long period of time, most likely putting upward pressure on prices, we also have UBI, helicopter money, MMT, whatever you want to call it. We have more currency units in the economy circulating, chasing fewer goods and services. The result of this over time is always the same, and that is consumer price inflation. So to answer the question, is Peter Schiff right or wrong about inflation? I would answer by saying, if you're talking about consumer price inflation in areas like food, energy, shelter, education, healthcare, transportation, entertainment, and taxes, because let's remember, as the economy goes down, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam will be jacking taxes up for sure. But if you're referring to these things over a long period of time, I definitely think Peter Schiff is going to be proven right, and prices for these items will go up. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.